Hello and welcome to the channel of DM25. Today we are joined by Jorge Tamames. He has a PhD from University College Dublin and currently teaches European political economy at the University Carlos III of Madrid. Jorge, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you doing?
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. All is good here. Rainy day in Madrid. Rainy month, actually.
Yeah, we're both from Madrid, actually. So we've had two Madrileños in a row. I want to start talking about the joint press conference with President Volodymyr Zelensky and President Donald Trump that we recently saw, because what we want to touch upon today mainly is the geopolitical tensions that are currently happening, especially within Europe and especially in relation to Ukraine. And obviously, we need to talk about this joint press conference. This event saw the Ukrainian and American leaders confront each other in a blow-up that ushers in a new phase of the war in Ukraine, one under a Trump presidency. And I was wondering, what do you make of the apparent antagonism between the two leaders?
Well, the first thing that I'll say is that I had to watch the clip several times, and this is not something that I usually do. My background is in foreign affairs. I studied international relations. I worked at a foreign policy journal in the think tank for a while, so this is sort of my bread and butter. And I had never seen an exchange on that level. Just the humiliation of a guest who is also a head of state in the White House, in front of the press, with the press participating in it. I was shocked, and I am not usually one to be sort of shocked or Trump has always generated this sort of sometimes a bit prudish reaction regarding, he doesn't respect norms. He doesn't respect due process. He's like this vulgar guy. And I usually don't have much patience for that, but I was surprised. I think on a formal level, it was just something very different to watch. And I guess it goes to the differences between his first administration and the second one. This is the kind of thing you would have not seen in the first Trump White House, because at the end of the day, he had to rely on a lot of people who were not Trump world characters like he has around him now, right? These were more standard Republican operators. Rex Tillerson, the guy who first ran his Department of State, was a guy who came from the big oil industry. So the more standard profiles you would see in a normal Republican administration. So in a way, I had this feeling that this was new ground. This entire concern with Trump in the way that he doesn't respect the way things are usually done and so forth, I found myself taking it a bit more seriously in the last 2 months than I did in the past. Now, the question, what do I think it represented in terms of the substance? I'm not sure to what extent this style is going to work for this administration or not. And what I mean by that is that I think it was very counterproductive in terms of, I think Trump has been extraordinarily successful in galvanizing the EU to sort of become independent or become more autonomous from the US with events like this one, or like J.D. Vance's visit in the Munich Security Conference, right? And this is something that was not on the menu 2 months ago. So, the future German Chancellor, Merz, when he was running for office, his whole deal was, we're going to get along pretty well with Trump. We'll be able to reach some deals. He's not our favorite guy, but, we can actually live with this guy. We'll be pragmatic. And, on election night, he said, my first concern is to become independent from the US. So I think this has been the first effect of this change in forms rather than substance, because in terms of the substance, this is the stuff he ran on. Well, the Ukraine stuff, not other stuff that he's actually pushing, and we can talk about it. But yeah, that's sort of my reading of the whole scene. At first I was shocked, and then looking at the reaction, I think, well, maybe they're not reading the room correctly. And I don't mean the room of the meeting in which it took place, but like the broader room of the way Europeans are going to react. Public opinion in Ukraine might shift or not, and ultimately whether Russia will actually pick up on the deal that is being offered to them at this point.
Right. Just to check your thoughts on another important point related to this newly Trump administration era, the United States and Ukraine plan to sign a mirrors deal, which has seen much controversy. According to the deal, Ukraine will contribute 50% of future proceeds from state-owned mineral resources, oil and gas, to an investment fund, which will then invest to promote the safety, security, and prosperity of Ukraine. This deal appears to imply that private companies will need to get involved in the mining process, within the vague information that we have been receiving about this deal. Do you believe, given what we know, do you believe it can be perceived as simply laying bare the American interest in exploiting Ukrainian natural resources for the benefit of the American capitalist class? Is there anything in this for working class Americans?
Okay, so let's start with the last part. Is there something in this for working class Americans? I'd say no. I mean, on the face of it, there doesn't seem to be much. I can have some sympathy for the people who voted for the first Trump term, right? With a working class background, expecting to get sort of a better deal than what was being offered by Hillary Clinton in 2017. But at this point, I think with Trump, you sort of know what you're getting to an extent. I'll qualify that a bit further on. But in terms of what is the American working class getting out of this deal, I don't know if this deal is viable at all. So sometimes it's hard to take these announcements on their face, and usually they create outrage, of course, because it looks like a shakeup, and it seems to be a shakeup in exchange for some very dubious security guarantees. Now, I'm not an expert in rare earth or their processing or critical minerals, so take this with a grain of salt, pun unintended. But from what I've read, it seems like a lot of these rare earths, they come from old maps from back in the Soviet Union in the 70s and 80s. It's not sure whether they can be mined or they're economically viable as of today. A lot of the places that have to be mined are sort of where the fighting is taking place. So none of that was a problem because you even managed to get a peace deal. So then presumably you'd get American companies that go there and invest in the mining process, right? Mining is an economic sector that requires a lot of capital investment, long time horizons before you can get credit on your investment, and sort of a very stable judicial and regulatory framework. Those are not things you're going to be getting right now in the Donbas region of Ukraine, or even in Ukraine or the full Russian occupied areas. So I don't see how this deal amounts to much other than something that, Trump can announce and feel happy about. And I think here the experience of his first term in office is instructive, right? We saw a lot of this during the first Trump term. So that's my general read on the deal. So then it seems like it doesn't make much sense. But one of the interpretations I've heard of this deal was that rather than coming from the White House, it was something that the Ukrainians and Zelensky pitched to Donald Trump. Again, if that is the case, that seems to me a sort of genius move to present him with a deal that he likes and that is going to, create some shock and some stupor, but that there's very little workable substance behind it. But ultimately, we'll have to wait and see, but I don't think this deal, as of now, leading anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I just personally felt like this was just, something. It's like, well, we should have known, like, if the US is after anything, or the EU, now we're gonna get to that, but if it's after anything, would end up be exploiting natural resources. Like, I think if we look at the history of wars, and the wars especially that the US has enjoyed joining and pushing for, I mean, I don't know, I was quite shocked that anyone would be shocked at the US kind of pursuing that kind of interest.
I mean, I was also shocked because this was nowhere on the cards during the campaign, right?
Yeah.
Unless I'm much mistaken, I don't remember hearing about this at all throughout the past year. Maybe I'm wrong. But I'm getting the sense, and this is something that I think it's worth keeping in mind because the pace of announcements from this administration in the first month and a half has been so overwhelming. Sometimes it's just almost unavoidable that you feel sort of demoralized and overwhelmed and like you don't even have a grip on what is happening. And I think at points like that, it's worth keeping in mind that these guys, they won an election for a variety of reasons, but an important one was that there was a critical mass of Americans who thought that prices were too high and eggs were too expensive, right? So, you can say these were like sort of economic anxiety voters who voted because they thought they were getting a lousy deal with Bidenomics. And the Trump campaign did make a lot of emphasis on prices being too high throughout the campaign. So those people voted with that in their mind. And what they got is minerals deal, invading the Panama Canal. Canada should be the 51st state, and we should also own Greenland. I don't see how that is working very well for your sort of working class economic anxiety Trump voter in the long term. I don't think it's working for the stock market either. So you're like traditional Republican who's just hoping to get a good return on his investments from the Trump presidency, like happened last time when the stock market was booming. So I don't want to be too mechanicist and say, oh, the economy doesn't work, so he'll run into trouble. But it's worth keeping in mind that we're getting announcements of different deals every day, but he's not delivering on the basic deal that won the election for him.
Honestly, like, I don't think a Trump presidency works for anyone. Obviously not the working class, but also vast parts of the capitalist class, I don't think, or especially the professional managerial class, I don't think they're excited to have him. Hence, Trump derangement syndrome. Like, I believe that is absolutely a thing. I wanted to ask you, at the beginning of this month of March, Trump halted military aid to Ukraine, a cut that then expanded to include all military intelligence, while acknowledging Russia's guilt in illegally invading a sovereign country. We will probably agree that finding a diplomatic solution that seeks to de-escalate the military conflict should be prioritized. Do you believe these steps taken by President Trump bear any positive aspects at all, or are they counterproductive to these ends?
Well, I'm going to give you my easy answer, sort of a cop-out, but I do think it's too soon to tell because we don't know if this deal at this stage, this compromise has buy-in from the Russians. What we know is that the Ukrainian side has sort of been strong-armed to the negotiating table. Now, I think if you look at this war, none of the sides were going to get what they wanted originally, right? So Russia wanted to topple the entirety of the Ukrainian government, to march to Kiev, to install a puppet regime, and to annex the 4 regions that it proclaimed are part of New Russia, right? This is a term they used to refer to them. And then on the Ukrainian side, at one point, there was even talk of launching an offensive and being able to retake Crimea. This was really always a far-fetched idea. So neither side got what it would originally want from this war. And so sooner or later, you're going to have a negotiation, right? Now, the question is, what does that negotiation actually look like? If you had a peace settlement now, where Ukraine was forced to make a lot of concessions and, really the underlying issue was never resolved, and there's hostility between Ukraine and Russia, you'd basically have a rerun of the Minsk 1 and 2 accords after 2014, right? So I think you could envision a scenario in which you say, oh, well, you reach some sort of deal that at this point it seems like will please the Russian side much more so than the Ukrainian one. Although it is worth keeping in mind 2 things. One, that a couple months ago, if you looked at polling, public opinion polling in Ukraine, there was a plurality or a slim majority of people who said, yeah, we want a deal. We hope we can get one with Trump. That has changed slightly, I think, because of the systematic humiliations that Trump has visited upon, Ukraine's leadership and Ukrainians in general. And I think now that their resolve is sort of hardening. So again, that's another example of this administration being very counterproductive. But if you assume that there's the space for making a deal, fine. I think, the question is what happens the day after that? If we have the president of 2014 leading to 2022, then how do you avoid having a deal reached today leading to, another conflict 5 years down the line or 7 years down the line, right? So I think that's the big question that we really should be thinking about. What's going to happen after that deal?
Right. And, I do want to ask you about what you think would be the best case scenario, the best solution, if you will. But first, I want to also discuss the European side of this. So this month has also seen Ursula von der Leyen unveil a plan to rearm Europe, announcing we are in an era of rearmament. This includes defense investment loans to member states, use of the EU budget to direct more funds towards defense-related investments, and deploying private capital. How do you regard this initiative?
Okay, I'll say a couple of things about it that I think are good, because then I have several misgivings that I want to explore at length. I think to some extent, it is better than the alternative of what Trump was proposing, right? Which was that each European state raise defense spending to 5% of GDP. And it's good in that it takes the EU as the political subject that needs to make these decisions. So it's not NATO, which at this point is, I think, becoming more and more dysfunctional with each passing day. right? So it's the EU that needs to take its own defense seriously and become autonomous at a time when it's being threatened by both Trump and Putin, right? So that's what I think is good about the deal, and the fact that is like, the approach is sort of ambition when you look at the, well, not exactly the scale of billions that is mobilized, because here there's always a bit of creative accounting that we're used to see from Brussels, right? So I think if you compare it to next generation EU, it's lacking in that respect. But when you take into consideration the fact that it's happening at the same time as Germany, for example, reforms its debt brake, right? The constitutional amendment and makes it more flexible. That just happened today. Then you get a sense that there's sort of ambition to match what otherwise would be just like lofty declarations. So what I think is more problematic about it is that, so basically, thinks about European defense, and what they do is like you start with what you have and you work towards a number, right? This is the way that all of these discussions unfold. So what you have is like European defense, when you look at overall spending numbers, it's not actually a small number. We're used to thinking that Europe doesn't spend, that the EU doesn't spend enough on defense. And when you look at the aggregate numbers, depending on the metrics you use, but we do spend several times more than Russia does. And if you also take the UK into consideration, right? Sort of these like-minded allies, then you have almost twice the defense budget of China. So that's not an insignificant number by any means. The problem is, and this is sort of well known by now, that it's extraordinarily inefficient because it's fragmented in sort of 27 different armies. And so you don't generate economies of scale. You don't generate the sort of investment you would need to have a competitive defense industry that spans the entire union and so forth. So the problem that I see is what this program does is mainly it focuses on national defense budgets and says, yeah, you can raise them. We expect to get 650 billion euros out of that. And we will loosen the fiscal rules so that this doesn't immediately fall into the excessive deficit procedure, right? For countries like Spain, for example, or for most European countries who have to undergo this investment now. How long would that last for? Is that the best way to build a European defense capability? I'm very skeptical of it, right? The way I would go about it is slightly different. I would think okay, so we're in one of those rare moments of crisis in the EU right now, similar to the COVID crisis, where the more ambitious solutions are also the more pragmatic, right? Usually it's the opposite, right? It's like, we're asking for a pie in the sky. So I think you should start with the most ambitious proposal you can consider, and then work with that towards, landing that on the framework that the EU can work with. And so what would that look like? I think it would entail acknowledging that, yes, there is a security threat, even if the Ukraine situation is solved immediately, right? You need to have sort of the deterrence capability to avoid a scenario like 2014 to 2022, like what we were talking about before. But then it should be the EU that provides that, not NATO. You should not rely on the United States. The United States is not an ally in any sense of the word anymore. So you need to do this on your own. And you also need to define security very broadly, I think, for this to work. So yes, a part of it has to do with defense, right? And what we were just talking about. And this is what usually all the conversation focuses on. And that's part of the deal. But there's other stuff that the EU needs to do to actually establish a security worthy of that name. So at least three other areas besides defense. One would be climate security. You need to become energy independent, not just from Russia and oil and gas, but from the United States or the Gulf states. And that involves being very ambitious with the ongoing green transition. So you need to double down on that, not cut your resources to focus exclusively on defense. If you adopt a broad conception of security, that is also something that you need to take into consideration. You can't just leave it in the back burner and expect things to get better in the future. You also need to think of economic security, right? In terms of having a financial architecture that does not depend on the dollar system or US payment platforms, right? That involves anything from having a more internationalized euro to having a digital euro as a tool for payments, right? You can get really down to the weeds of the policies that you would need for this. But there's a big plank that has to do with your economic model. The fiscal rules that are extremely outdated, even after this program, right? They should be completely overhauled if you really want to meet the challenge that you face right now. Fourth area, and final one, would be sort of security from a social standpoint. If you do all these things and at the same time you have to do austerity because you have to balance a budget, then that sort of defeats the purpose of any of this. Especially keeping in mind that we sort of know by now, and there's considerable evidence that doing austerity, doing budgetary cuts, trimming down the welfare state actually empowers the very friends of Trump and Putin that are already reasonably strong in a lot of European states. So if you want to stop the far right, and if there's anything in the EU that is worth fighting for, it's probably a socioeconomic model that, provides social security in the form of the welfare state, public health care, public education, pensions, you name it. So that has to be like a big part of it. And so you get these four things, and then you think, okay, how are we going to pay for them? And then I think, a mixture of having more mutualized European debt, like Next Generation, and having its own, fiscal capacity in terms of, I don't know, I would consider not just punishing Russian oligarchs, but taxing the activity of American tech oligarchs for the EU to generate its own resources. And there are ways to do that, right? And you can talk about Russian stranded assets and a number of other sources of revenue that you can tap. So you'd have to be much more broad in your conception of security and not just focus on the defense industry and defense spending from a national perspective. Because ultimately, I hope this doesn't happen, and there's still ongoing discussion, but if this ends up being an excuse for member states to spend more money without clear strategic goals, and that ends up being, buying American equipment and increasing a security dependence that is already there, then you've doubled down on a problem, right? So I think there's some good elements to it, but I think it could be much improved and still needs sort of broader definition of security and much more fiscal ambition.
So basically, are you saying you think it would be preferable for member states to make less of a decision here and like for the EU to have a more sort of coordinated plan? And I'm just wondering, do you think the European Union, and I'm not talking Europe, I'm talking the European Union, would ever take that non-aligned perspective? Do you think that's plausible? Don't you feel like maybe European nations themselves would be more likely to, if they were democratic enough to not be sort of that constrained by the European Union, like, don't you feel like they would try to be non-aligned? Obviously, I'm kind of generalizing here, but I don't know. I'm just wondering, do you have hopes in the EU or do you have hopes in Europe? And what do you think is more likely, like for the EU to actually take a non-aligned stance, or for European countries? Because I don't know, I just struggle to believe that the EU would ever do that. So I kind of have the opposite reaction in that I would have more hope in European nations individually kind of taking that sort of stance and kind of making the right investments, or Europe as a sort of region rather than the EU specifically. But let me know your thoughts about this.
So I think there's one thing that is like, okay, should the EU pool its capacities together? That's one thing, right? And have like a more federated approach to these threats that it faces now and these challenges in the form of Russia, of the United States, of, having to develop its own autonomy. And then the other question is like about Europe's alignment, right? These are like, I'm going to try and parse them out because I think they're slightly distinct. So the way this is always posed is this question of, should you have a European army, right? And usually this is sort of like something that doesn't get discussed a lot beyond a theoretical level, right? Because there are like many operational and political hurdles along the way, but mostly it's a question of political will, right? That European states are reticent to share that degree of sovereignty. Now, I just think if you really are serious about having deterrence capability against Russia, which I think is very different from sort of getting involved in warmongering, right? After all, like Russia is the country that has the largest nuclear stockpile in the world. So I think anyone who was actively engaging in pushing them towards a war would be an idiot to do so. But I do think you need to develop deterrent capability. It makes much more sense to do that on an EU level than for each European state on its own. Unless you're willing to sustain, 5-6% of the GDP of every European state spent, or in my view, wasted on defense, right? So it's an idea, whose time has come in the sense that it's the easiest way out of this problem. Now, then the question, of course, is like, what does, a more united EU and in the realms of like foreign policy and defense policy stand for in the world, right? That question of like, can Europe be non-aligned? I would say Europe today is sort of disaligned, right? Because, correct me if I'm wrong, but the way you would have posed this question 2 months ago is that the EU is overly aligned with the United States and just following the United States initiative. Overnight, that has changed very dramatically. And so the EU already de facto finds itself in a place where it's having to come up with its own autonomous posture in regards, for example, to what happens in Ukraine, right? Now, that position is the one it was holding before the United States changed gears, but I think it's an interesting process. Now, I will say about that hasn't come to fruition because European leaders suddenly took that decision. It's because Trump snubbed them and then humiliated a few of them. and has done everything within his power to make that outcome possible. So I would think the challenge is not for the EU to strike its own path away from Trump now. The question is maintaining this after Trump is gone. And I'm sort of looking too far into the future. But if you think of, what happened during the Biden presidency, or even if you want to go further back in time after the Iraq War, when there was also talk of the need of becoming more detached in foreign policy positions from the United States. What do you see is that when the good times come back, and that usually means when there's a Democrat in the White House, Europeans become complacent. So this is an effort that you really need to sustain in time. Now, finally, and this is the hardest question to which I don't have an answer other than to say that the EU is, in spite of making progress along all these areas, and I think a lot of this is actually interesting and worthwhile, but it has some huge flaws in regards to how it aligns in the world, right? Just consider the now ongoing genocide in Gaza, right? We learned today that Israel resumed operations and killed between 300 and 400 Palestinians in one night. And the EU has been shamefully muted on this issue, except for a few voices, right? And for the most part, has acquiesced to what is basically a genocide on its doorstep. So I think striking a sort of, assertive position in defense of Ukraine's right to defend itself from annihilation in the face of an imperialist neighbor, it's all very well and good. I'm all for that position. I just think there should be coherence. It should also be held in Gaza, right? The EU should be much firmer in its condemnation of Israel. So that's one thing where its present disposition, its present alignment is very much lacking and very disappointing. The same is true of migration policy, right? We like to act scandalized at the policies that the Trump administration applies, but they're not that different. And in fact, many of them are directly inspired in what we do in our own borders. So, I do think the EU is taking several steps to become more autonomous from the US. I am skeptical that the way it is doing so is the best, the most useful, and that it doesn't have several aspects of it that can be counterproductive. But I realize that there are some areas where the state of affairs right now is pretty awful.
It certainly is. And I want to dive a little deeper into this topic of non-alignment. I think the EU, yes, it's not complacent to the Trump presidency, but I think it still is to the sort of what they understand as the default US, right? Which is Democrats or, never Trump Republicans and politics of the sort. And meanwhile, at DiEM25, we aim for a non-aligned, which doesn't mean neutral, Europe. Do you believe this is currently a possibility? And how do you believe it would impact the potential for more democratic European nations if we move in this direction?
Yeah, I think it's tied to what I was saying before, but so let me reframe it in a more accurate way. I think the EU, again, not by its own merits, but because of the effects of what Trump has done in 2 months, has become sort of disaligned from the US, right? And I am I will say I am hopeful that this is not just a passing sort of fleeting sentiment of Trump is horrible, then we'll go back to business. I want to think that there is a learning process going on, especially in the way that we had, Biden between these two Trump terms. The way that events have unfolded would mean that Europeans would be, profoundly obtuse not to continue investing and becoming independent from the United States after Trump is gone. And, and who knows what will happen in 4 years. So on that regard, I'm, let's say, mildly hopeful, or at least I've been surprised by the degree of resolve I've seen from key European figures. So I would not have expected to see a center-right German politician say, my first concern is becoming independent from the United States, right? I have to acknowledge that if I would have been told, will you see this in the next year, a couple months ago, I'd have said, no, absolutely not. I think Europeans will try and paper over their differences with Trump, but fundamentally not change or, within. So in that regard, yeah, but as I was saying before, if you look at other issues, so if you look at the Palestinian question, right? If you look at migration policy, these are areas where there's no change and where the current alignment or the current posture, to the extent the EU has a coherent posture or the sum of the different member states' postures is awful. Now, there are a couple other instances which are a bit more, I guess, we still need to wait and see what happens. But so, for example, I would say I'm interested to see what happens in relations with China. I think if you want to become autonomous from the US and secure from Russia, and at the same time you take fighting climate change seriously, you cannot afford to follow the US into a confrontation with China into the Indo-Pacific. You just can't. You need to find a better way to engage with China, right? So the EU famously has this plank or this platform where it views China as a sort of, let me see if I get this correctly, at the once it is a partner, it is a competitor, and it is a rival, and different, and depending on what policies you look at. So I would say find more areas of partnership and less for rivalry in the coming years, because you cannot afford more antagonism, and more broadly, because I think that China, whatever the issues that that we may have with different policies that they apply, and there are several, but ultimately it is not a destabilizing force in international affairs the way the US and Russia are, right? So yeah, I think that's we'll see what happens, right? I think really that's another area where if we are going to take European autonomy seriously, we need certain changes to take place, or otherwise we'll get stuck back where we were now. Another region that is interesting in terms of partnerships is Latin America, right? So this EU-Mercosur deal, again, is some of the aspects of it is it's a free trade deal. It was agreed by governments on both sides, but it is problematic. It has redistributionary effects, like most trade deals. So here you can see how reaching out to other regions of the world is interesting, and I think there are many governments in Latin America that would come as natural partners for the EU right now, right? I'm obviously thinking of Brazil, not Argentina. But again, there are also trade-offs to these deals. But I think if the EU really wants to take this question of becoming autonomous seriously, that it needs to reach out to these sort of partners. You need to develop a more constructive relationship with China. You need to develop a strong partnership with countries like Brazil. I think in those cases is where we're truly going to see if this is something worth taking seriously, or if it's back to the mean once we get past this current crisis.
Right. We are going to move on to a slightly different topic, though not unrelated. You have expertise in the concept of populism. We're going to leave links down in the description so people can check out your work on the topic. And we've been talking about, we've mentioned Trump derangement syndrome. Basically, in all of this geopolitical scenario, what do you believe is the role of populism? And has its relationship with the states contributed to taking us where we are now?
Right. So, most people tell you there are two kinds of populism, right? Populism of the left and of the radical right. At this point, I think talking about right-wing populism is sort of inaccurate. It's just basically like an extreme right movement. I wrote a book a few years back and it focused on left-wing populism. I was very hopeful for its prospects when I began writing the book. Unfortunately, I finished writing it as the second Bernie Sanders campaign came to a halt and was defeated, which was really depressing for me because I lived in the United States in 2016. I participated in the first one and was very hopeful that he would win the Democratic nomination. That did not happen. In Spain, too, sort of like Podemos and then Sumar has sort of stagnated electorally, and sort of they are the junior partner to the traditional center-left. And I think overall, left populists are just, or left-wing movements in general, parties and movements to the left of traditional social democracy are uncomfortable with this juncture, right? Because, defense is not traditionally the things that we would like to talk about, right? And defense policy and so forth. So it's, a juncture that we're inherently uncomfortable with. Now, what I will say is that, and I think this is a testimony to the progress that was made by a lot of these movements during the past decade, we should never let our guard down and think that, austerity is never coming back to the EU. It could. The, new fiscal rules are better than the old ones, but they're still leave much to be desired. Right now, as of today, and especially for all of this decade, austerity has not been on the menu in the EU in the way that it was after the 2008 crisis, right? Because I think that it's been assumed that this is a losing proposal, and it was, the degree of social and political dislocation that it will generate makes it just unaffordable as an economic policy, right? And absolutely counterproductive. So I think that's something that was gained by a lot of the advances that these movements made. So I will say that, and even if they don't have the presence that they had 10 years ago, I think that is a lasting legacy, and we should be mindful of that. Now, In terms of the right-wing populists, or more like the extreme right in general, I'm really interested to see whether Trump is good for their electoral business or not. I am getting the sensation that he can become a huge albatross for extreme right parties and movements in Europe. Right. I mean, if you look at, Canada is sort of the more prescient example, right? The sort of slightly Trumpified right-wing party is down in the polls, and the liberals are the ones who are benefiting most from that. But I think you might start seeing similar movements in the UK and in other European countries, right? I mean, I think it's worth keeping in mind that overnight these parties have gone from, not that they ever were, but pretending to be the voice of the downtrodden or being sort of an anti-system option, to being the favorite choice of the president of the United States and the world's richest man, who is boosting them all the time. So it's just very hard to maintain an anti-system appeal. Not that they ever had a genuine one, right? It was always a facade. But at this point, I think it's very hard to keep that reputation up. So I think in the long, or in the medium, even in the medium term, this is going to present a series of very hard trade-offs for them. I mean, and I don't want to be overly optimistic, because I know every now and then people say, "Oh, this is the end of the far right." I remember people said it with COVID, right? Because science is now very important, and of course that never happened. They backfired. So need to keep like a cool head about this, and not make premature judgments. But I think Trump in the United States is going to pose a series of problems for them, and I'll be interested to see if and whether they can solve them.
Right. I wonder what you think of populism as an anti-politics form of politics, which can be embodied by both the sort of left-wing populists that have ended up either being made by and for the professional managerial class, but also the, sort of more Trump himself or the Trump-aligned parties in Europe as well, which I think what I see is that they are the ones who still seem to hold this position of the outsider. That seems to be something that they have managed to keep. I don't know, I'm wondering, how do you regard this difference, and does it have to do perhaps with, I'm just going to give you an example, I just want to know your thoughts on these developments of the last few years. Basically, while Podemos and then Sumar got in government with PSOE, so populist left with center left, Giorgia Meloni or Trump, definitely never appeared to sort of make concessions to the parties that within their nations were regarded as default government parties that had been there for a really long time. The so-called swamp maybe that had to be drained. And therefore, they kind of managed to be seen as still outsiders, even though obviously Giorgia Meloni, great friends with the US, great friends with the EU apparently. So, and not like there's that much there in a way, and obviously things can change. But to an extent, it seems like there is more complacency perhaps on the side of the left populists to sort of join, even in France, right? To sort of join the center and prioritize being anti-far right over perhaps, saying, okay, you know what, let's just do a more sort of universalist long-term project and prioritize that, even if it means risking more far-right victories, because we refuse to work with center-left parties, which working class people just are so done with, perhaps less so in Spain, I will say. But how would you basically update perhaps your views on populism that you had in the more sort of Bernie Sanders era to nowadays that we have seen more sort of developments in the story?
Yeah, I mean, we could have like an entire other session on this subject, because it's like, well, first of all, you'd have to sort of come up with a good definition of populism, which is extraordinarily frustrating, right? So what I will say is like, okay, populism, general definition, like it's like you're going to be talking about the people versus elites, right? And in doing so, you have a discourse that accepts that there is antagonism within society, right? So democracy is not just about consensus and reaching deals with like-minded legislators. That is a part of it, but it's also about conflict, right? And so you work with that. And that already is very different from the style of sort of more established center-left or center-right politicians. So that's one thing. Then there's the question of, yeah, you're posing a question on this idea of normalization, right? Or sort of losing your anti-system edge. I mean, what I'll say is I don't think there is a strategic roadmap that just works well in every single case. So, for example, Podemos did try in Spain to overtake the center left, even if that meant that the right would govern. And what happened is that it just failed to overtake the center left, right? So one of the things that I learned is that, it's good to have like a discourse that is antagonistic. It's good like to mobilize people's righteous anger with a way that the economy doesn't work for them or that they're being given a lousy deal. And that's not something to be criticized. I just got really frustrated in the United States when people would compare Bernie Sanders having a sort of angry rhetoric with Trump scapegoating vulnerable communities for sort of things that were mostly made up, right? I think there's a big distinction in how you use that antagonism. But ultimately, I don't think there's one clear path to victory. And what I do think is that older, more established parties have sort of an institutional grounding that helps them outcompete populist sort of insurgencies in the long run, right? So my takeaway was a sort of like slightly boring institutionally story, right? That like building organizational strength, building lasting institutions, all of that is really important if you want to have a successful candidacy against sort of the more established parties, right? And where that runs a bit against the populist logic is in this idea of the populist leader, right? Which is usually highly charismatic and organizationally, sadly, is never subject to like very strong counterweights within the party or movement, right? And in the long term, this poses a lot of problems. Now, are they insurmountable? No, I don't think so. Of course, if you look at like the trajectory of a lot of these movements, well, it seems a big problem, right? But I don't think that means that this approach is not very useful in many contexts. I don't think the right necessarily has done a better job of this. So if you look at like Meloni has been very successful electorally, but what she has done since she got to power, at least from where I'm standing, seems like a process of normalization, right? Like she has tried to sort of be or seem like a responsible European player, trying to make the hard right fit in with the center right at the EU level. Very different from, for example, Matteo Salvini, who was a hooligan in his first term in office, and then now he's sort of a marginal player in relation to Meloni. I don't know. I say this because I don't think there is this correct path that you must take, and I don't think necessarily toning down your messaging at one point, and this can be a tactical choice. It doesn't really mean that you're sort of selling your essence or so forth. So I think, this is all to say I don't have a specific answer on this, other than to say that I do think it is important that left-wing parties and movements become able again, like they were during the last decade, of mobilizing people's anger, right? People who are angry at the way things work, people's legitimate outrage. It should not be the case that the far right is the only option out there that is mobilizing people who are angry at the way things work. Because even if they make up scapegoats and have a hateful rhetoric, there are things to be legitimately angry about in our societies and our economies, and these should not be left for demagogues to exploit.
Mm-hmm. And within those parties, why do you think we failed, basically? Like, what do you think is the main reason at the core? What would you think is the main thing we need to change? What was the biggest sort of failure of the populist left in the last 10 years, basically?
Man, like if I could answer your question quickly, I would not written like a really long and boring book about it. That's what I'll say.
Give us
But
a
I think
summary.
that a lot of it depends. So a lot of it depends on the sort of like more structural background conditions that I was telling you about, right? Do you have does your movement successfully become a party, where you can do things like changing a leadership without having everyone fall into infighting, or, have a scenario where your immediate goals are not attained and you don't collapse because you're blaming each other, which is largely what happened with Podemos. So they did a very bad job of managing internal party tension, right? And that had to do with institutional choices that they made on how to manage the party. And then on the, on the more immediate level, sort of on a more tactical level, then there's this question of like, yeah, what you were saying, should you be an outsider, right? Even if it means the right governance, or should you be sort of, joining forces with the center left, even if, and then again, this all depends on whether you're like the main actor in the coalition government or if they're the secondary actor, right? I think Sumar actually had a good electoral result considering as the junior partner in a coalition government. If you look at like almost every single political scientist will tell you that these parties should have a horrible electoral result when they come back to the polls, right, after a coalition government. And they sort of held their own, but that remains to be seen for the next elections. It seems they'll have a much harder time replicating that success. But so, yeah, I mean, it takes time. And then like at different junctures, I don't think there is a correct way in which, what happens if you, a correct way in which, what happens if you try and be an outsider all the time, right? And you're identifying the center left as your enemy. A lot of the people who vote for the center left, whom you need arithmetically to eventually vote for you, if you want to get the majority that will allow you to govern without the center left, will not vote for you because they will perceive you as a threat rather than as a potential partner, right? So these are sort of the electoral dilemmas of left populism, which are not very different from those of other electoral families, but they're there. For the far right, I think it's slightly different. And of course, it depends on the country. And if you look at Trump's success, you need to keep in mind that the US is a presidentialist system. So that makes it very different. I think Bernie Sanders could have realistically won in 2016 against Donald Trump. I don't think it's overly optimistic to say that. I think he would have easily won, right? And then we would have had a very distinct last 8 years. He would have been leaving the presidency now. And so instead of having this sort of doom and gloom conversation about the far right, we'll be talking about how, populism and social democracy go hand in hand and whatnot, So it's worth keeping that in mind, the degree of contingency in modern politics. We really don't have a sort of master key that will unlock us anything that can happen. And even the most informed analysts are surprised all the time. So I've learned to sort of live with this uncertainty and be a bit more humble about my priors about what might happen at a given point in time.
Yeah, I mean, the end of history is certainly over, and it's just a matter of what do we do with the wreckage, basically, that is left. And I mean, I don't know. These were all our questions. Clearly, the conclusion is we are not very sure, but it was still clarifying to hear about the geopolitical tensions and how to understand them right now.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thank you so much, Jorge. Gracias. We're really happy to have you here. Where can people find you? What do you suggest they read?
Not on Twitter anymore. I'm on Blue Sky with my name and surname. I write every now and then. That's where I share most of my work. So that's where people can find me. Yeah.
Great. We will leave the link down below. Thank you so much again. And thanks everyone for joining us today.
Of course. Have a good one.